The air in the glass-walled office of Vantage Marketing was filtered, expensive, and smelled faintly of cold espresso and ambition. Ariel Michaels sat on the edge of the designer mesh chair, her back straight, her hands clasped over her resume. She had worn her best navy suit, the one that tailored her size 18 frame with precision, and a silk scarf that added a touch of elegance to her mahogany skin. She was overqualified. She had 25 years of experience. But as the 30-year-old hiring manager, Tyler, glanced at her, he didn't see a veteran strategist. He saw a silhouette that didn't fit the aesthetic. "You have an impressive history, Ariel," Tyler said, his eyes never rising above her chin. He was scrolling on his tablet. "But we're pivoting. We need someone who really lives the brand. Someone with high-octane energy." The door opened. A young woman, likely 22, with legs like a gazelle and a tiny waist cinched by a trendy belt, popped her head in. "Hey, Tyler! Did you see the TikTok metrics for the morning drop?" Tyler's face transformed. His eyes lit up. "Incredible work, Chloe. Just give me a second." He turned back to Ariel. The light in his eyes instantly extinguished. "We've decided to go with Chloe for the lead strategist role. She just fits the brand culture, but we'll keep your resume on file." Ariel felt the familiar sting, the cold, sharp blade of being discarded before she'd even spoken. As she walked toward the elevator, the click-clack of Chloe's 4-inch heels followed her. She caught her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass. "I'm 53, she thought, her chest tightening. "I'm a size 18. Women like me don't get noticed. We get erased." The smell of rosemary chicken and slow-cooked greens filled her sister's dining room, but for Ariel, the air felt thick and suffocating. Sunday dinner was supposed to be a sanctuary, but today it felt like a courtroom. "Ariel, honey," Aunt Esther started, reaching across the table to pat Ariel's hand. Her eyes weren't kind. They were assessing. "That dress is awfully bright. Mustard yellow is a lot of fabric for a woman of your carriage." Ariel looked down at her favorite floral wrap dress. "I like the color, Auntie. It makes me feel alive." "At 53, dear, we should be looking for graceful," Esther countered, sipping her iced tea. "Subdued. You're past your prime for trying to stand out. It just makes people stare for the wrong reasons. And you're still single? It's because you're too loud. In your clothes and your spirit. Men want something lighter." The table went quiet. Her sister gave a sympathetic, pitying look that hurt worse than the insult. Ariel felt her throat close. She was a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a professional, yet she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. "I am invisible to the world," she realized, a stray tear threatening to spill, "and a burden to those who see me." That night, Ariel sat on the edge of her bed in her small, quiet apartment. The rejection from the job and the cruelty of her family swirled in her mind like a dark tide. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys. She needed to breathe. She needed to be somewhere where no one knew her prime had supposedly passed. On a whim, fueled by a mixture of desperation and a sudden spark of rebellion, she booked a flight. Destination: Seoul, South Korea. 2 weeks. A solo spiritual reset. She had $4,000 in savings and a heart that was breaking under the weight of her own insignificance. She knelt by her bed, the floorboards creaking under her weight. She didn't have a long theological prayer tonight. She didn't have the strength for it. She closed her eyes, her hands trembling. "Lord," she whispered into the dark, "the world says I'm finished. They say I'm too big, too old, and too much. But you made me." She took a ragged breath, the silence of the room pressing against her. "If you see me, please, show me." The lights of Seoul were a neon blur that made Ariel's head throb. It was her third day in the city, and the jet lag had finally caught up with her, manifesting as a heavy, rhythmic dizziness. The grand lobby of the Lotte Signal was a cathedral of glass and gold, but all Ariel wanted was the sanctuary of her bed. She drifted toward the elevators, her eyes half closed. A set of double doors plated in brushed gold slid open with a soft melodic chime. She didn't notice the discreet restricted access sign or the fact that the keypad required a biometric scan that had somehow remained active from a previous user. She simply stepped inside, leaned her weight against the mirrored wall, and pressed the only button lit, the penthouse. The ascent was silent and sickeningly fast. When the doors whispered open, Ariel expected a hallway. Instead, she stepped directly into a world of cold marble, shadow, and the copper tang of blood. He was slumped against a massive mahogany desk that overlooked the glittering Han River. Even in a state of collapse, he was terrifying. He was younger than her, perhaps 45, with hair as black as obsidian and a jawline that looked carved from the same stone as the floor. His ivory silk shirt, worth more than Ariel's car, was ruined, soaked through with a spreading, visceral crimson on his left side. His eyes snapped to hers. They weren't the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a wolf who knew he was cornered. His right hand hovered near a matte black handgun resting on the desk. "Get out," he rasped in Korean, then repeated it in a low, jagged English. "Out." Ariel froze. The internal monologue that usually told her she was invisible screamed at her to run. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a boss or a threat. She saw a man who was losing too much blood too fast. The erasure she felt her whole life suddenly became her armor. If the world didn't see her, she didn't have to follow the world's rules. She didn't have to be afraid. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered. She didn't run. She walked toward him. "Stay back," he warned, his fingers twitching toward the weapon. "Hush now," Ariel said, her voice dropping into the low, honeyed tone she used to calm her Sunday school students. It was a voice of absolute authority and absolute peace. "You're bleeding through that fine shirt, and if you pick up that gun, you'll pass out before you can aim it. Let me see." Jang Ho froze. In all his years of violence, no one had ever spoken to him with such mother wit and lack of fear. He watched, stunned, as this woman, this beautiful bronze-skinned woman with curves that defied the sharp edges of his world, knelt in her bright floral skirt on his blood-stained marble. She didn't flinch at the sight of the wound. She reached up and unwrapped the long, vibrant silk scarf from her neck, the one her aunt had called too much. "This is going to hurt," she murmured. She pressed the fabric directly into the wound. Jang Ho let out a guttural hiss, his head hitting the mahogany desk as his muscles corded in agony. His hand flew out, his thick fingers gripping her forearm with bruising force. He was at peak physical power even now. He could have snapped her bone like a dry twig. Ariel didn't pull away. She leaned her weight into the pressure, her eyes locked on his. "I've got you," she whispered. "I'm right here. Jehovah Rapha, the Lord who heals. Please, Father, keep this man's heart beating. Steady him." Jang Ho's breathing was ragged. He looked down at her hands, dark, warm, and steady against his skin. The pain was an ocean, but her voice was a lighthouse. For the first time in his life, someone was touching him not to take something, not to hurt him, and not out of obligation. His eyes, dark and predatory, didn't scan past her. They didn't look at her age or the size of her waist with judgment. They stopped. They lingered on the softness of her face, the silver at her temples, and the profound, unshakable calm in her brown eyes. The air in the room shifted. The violence was still there, lurking in the corners, but the center of the room was held by her peace. Jang Ho's grip on her arm loosened, his fingers tracing the skin of her wrist almost wonderingly. He was a man who lived in a desert of spirits, and he had just found a well. "Who are you?" he managed to breathe, his voice a low vibration that Ariel felt in her own chest. Ariel managed a small, tired smile, though her heart was hammering. "Just a woman who was looking for the lobby, but I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Outside, the sounds of shouting and heavy footsteps began to echo in the hallway. The world was coming for him. Jang Ho looked at the door, then back at Ariel. He saw her floral dress, her kind face, and the blood-soaked silk of her scarf. A desperate, impulsive plan formed in his mind. "You," he whispered, his eyes burning into hers. "You are going to be my salvation." The silence of Ariel's modest hotel room was a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. They were clean now, the blood scrubbed away with hotel soap, but she could still feel the phantom heat of the man's skin. She had been escorted out by men in suits as soon as the cleanup crew arrived. They hadn't been unkind, but they had been efficient, treating her like a piece of furniture that had been moved out of the way. She was back to being invisible, or so she thought. A sudden rhythmic knock at her door made her heart skip. When she opened it, she didn't find hotel staff. She found a wall of charcoal gray wool. Two massive men stood guard as a third man stepped forward. It was him, Jang Ho. He looked different today. The silk shirt was gone, replaced by a bespoke three-piece suit that hugged his broad shoulders and narrow waist. A bandage was hidden beneath the fabric, but his stride was steady, predatory. He carried the scent of sandalwood and ozone, a crisp, electric aroma that seemed to colonize the small room. "Mr. Jang Ho," Ariel breathed, clutching the doorframe, "you should be resting." "I don't rest when my house is in disorder," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He walked past her into the room, as if he owned the air within it. He turned, eyes scanning her simple cotton pajamas and the silver strand of her hair. He didn't look away. He looked into her. "My board of directors is restless," he began, pacing the small space. "The merger with the Hong Kong firms requires a stable image. They think I am too volatile, too unattached. They want a wife, or at least the promise of one." Ariel blinked, confused. "I don't see what that has to do with—" "I've spent 40 years surrounded by women who are made of glass," Jang Ho interrupted, stopping inches from her. "They break under pressure. They cry at the sight of blood. They look at my position, not the man. But you—" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. He laid it on the bedside table. Ariel looked down. It was a check. The zeros seemed to go on forever. $5 million, Jang Ho said. 3 months. You live in my home. You wear the ring. You stand by my side at 3 key events. After the merger is signed, the contract ends. You go back to America and never have to work a day in your life. Ariel stared at the check, then up at him. A short, breathless laugh escaped her lips. It was the laugh of someone who had spent decades being told she was too much and not enough, all at once. "Mr. Jang Ho, it's a very expensive joke," she said, shaking her head. "Look at me. I'm 53 years old. I'm a size 18. In your world, I'm a grandmother or a ghost. I'm old enough to be your very older sister." Jang Ho didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He stepped into her personal space, the sheer heat of his body radiating through his suit. He was shorter than the giants at the door, but he felt like a mountain. He leaned down, his face so close she could see the golden flecks in his dark irises. The scent of him, sandalwood and ozone, filled her lungs, making her dizzy. I don't need a girl, Ariel, he whispered, his voice vibrating in her marrow. I've had girls. They are ornaments. They are whispers. I need a woman with weight. I need a woman who can stand in a room full of wolves, look them in the eye, and make them feel small. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. His touch wasn't tentative. It was possessive. You didn't flinch when you saw my blood. You didn't tremble when you saw my gun. You prayed for my soul while the world was trying to take my life. He leaned closer, his lips inches from her ear. I don't care about your age. I want your strength. I want your peace. And I want the world to wonder how a man like me got a woman like you. Ariel's breath hitched. For 53 years, she had tried to shrink herself to fit into the margins. But Jang Ho was looking at her as if she were the entire page. 3 months, she whispered, her voice trembling. 3 months, he promised, and I will protect you from every tongue that dares to speak against you. Ariel looked at the check, then at the man who looked at her as if she were a queen hidden in plain sight. She thought of her Aunt Esther, of Tyler from the marketing firm, and of the God who she had asked to show her. Okay, she said, her voice finding its steel, but I'm bringing my Bible. A ghost of a smile touched Jang Ho's lips. Bring whatever you need, Ariel, as long as you bring yourself. The estate was a fortress of glass and charcoal stone, perched on the cliffs of Pyeongchang-dong, overlooking the sprawling lights of Seoul. To Ariel, it felt like a cathedral built for a god of industry and shadows. Every surface was polished, every corner sharp. But as she moved through the halls with her modest suitcase, she felt a strange, hushed reverence in the air. Jang Ho was waiting for her in the dining room. The table was a slab of live-edge walnut, long enough to seat 20, but only 2 places were set. As she approached, Jang Ho rose. The movement was fluid, despite the bandage beneath his shirt. He didn't wait for a servant. He stepped behind her chair and pulled it out with a steady hand. His knuckles were bruised, a stark contrast to the delicate porcelain on the table. You don't have to do that, Ariel murmured, her voice echoing in the vast room. I do, Jang Ho replied, his voice a low vibration. He didn't return to his seat immediately. He lingered behind her, his presence a heavy, warm weight. In this house, you are not a guest. You are the priority. The meal was a parade of sensory delights. Braised short ribs that fell apart at the touch of a fork, chilled pear soup, and tea that smelled of toasted rice. Throughout it all, Jang Ho barely ate. He watched her. It wasn't the way the interviewer had looked through her, or the way her aunt looked at her with pity. His gaze was possessive. It tracked the movement of her throat when she swallowed. It settled on the curve of her shoulder. He looked at her as if she were a complicated riddle he was determined to solve. The next morning, the transformation began, but it wasn't the makeover Ariel expected. She was in her dressing room, sitting before a triptych of mirrors, tentatively brushing out her hair. She had let the silver grow in at her temples. A map of her life, she called it, though her sisters called it giving up. The door opened. Jang Ho entered, followed by 3 assistants carrying racks of clothes. He dismissed the assistants with a sharp flick of his wrist. He walked over to Ariel and took the brush from her hand. Ariel froze. Through the mirror, she saw him standing behind her. He didn't look at the silver strands with distaste. He ran a hand over the crown of her head, his fingers moving slowly through the coils of her hair. The silver, he whispered, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection. It looks like moonlight caught in dark water. Why do you try to hide it? It makes me look my age, she admitted, her voice trembling. It makes you look like you have survived things, he countered. It makes you look refined, unlike the girls who have nothing written on their faces because they have lived through nothing. He turned to the racks. He didn't bring her the slimming black dresses or the shapeless tunics her aunt favored. He pulled out a gown of emerald green silk so heavy it felt like liquid. Then, a blazer of midnight blue velvet that caught the light with every movement. They're very bold, Ariel said, touching the silk. They'll make people look at me. All of me. That is the point, Jang Ho said. He stepped closer, his scent of sandalwood and ozone wrapping around her like a second skin. He reached out, his hand settling on the curve of her hip, a size 18 curve that she had spent 30 years trying to camouflage. He didn't squeeze. He simply let his palm rest there, acknowledging the fullness of her. I don't want to hide you, Ariel. I want to frame you. I want them to see the weight of the woman who holds my peace in her hands. He leaned down, his breath hot against her neck. Wear the silk. Let them look. Let them see what a real woman looks like. As he left the room, Ariel turned back to the mirror. For the first time in a decade, she didn't look at her reflection and see a list of flaws to be corrected. She saw a woman of substance. She saw the moonlight in her hair and the strength in her shoulders. He looks at me like I'm a masterpiece, she thought, her heart racing with a terrifying, addictive heat. But I'm just a woman who forgot how to be seen. And God help me, I think I'm starting to like it. The invisible woman was gone. In her place, a queen was being forged in silk and shadow. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of monochromatic elegance, black tuxedos and stark white diamonds. It was a room designed to make anyone who didn't fit the mold feel like a blemish. Ariel stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand trembling slightly as it rested on the sleeve of Jang Ho's charcoal suit. She was a vision in the emerald green silk he had chosen. The fabric clung to her curves, celebrating the fullness of her hips and the strength of her shoulders. Around her neck sat a vintage collar of gold and raw emeralds that glowed against her deep bronze skin. Her silver strand hair was styled in a sophisticated updo that made her look like a bronze statue brought to life. Breathe, Jang Ho murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. They are just ghosts in expensive clothes, Ariel. You are the only thing real in this room. As they descended, the room fell into a suffocating silence. It wasn't the silence of admiration. It was the silence of a jury. Heads turned. Whispers began to ripple like a slow-moving poison. They reached the floor, and Jang Ho was immediately pulled into a circle of investors. Ariel stepped toward the buffet, reaching for a glass of sparkling water. That's when she heard it. Min Hee, a 24-year-old socialite with a waist the size of a bracelet and a face tightened by surgery, stood only a few feet away. She didn't even bother to lower her voice. I heard the chairman was bringing a secret fiancé, Min Hee said, leaning toward a waiter with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. But looking at her, why did he bring his nanny? Or is she the cook? I suppose at his age, he needs someone to remind him to take his vitamins and fry his chicken. A giggle erupted from the cluster of young women surrounding her. The sound felt like glass shards against Ariel's skin. The old familiar erasure tried to take hold. She felt herself wanting to shrink, to hide the emerald silk, to disappear back into the shadows where she was safe. But she wasn't alone. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy, the way it does right before a lightning strike. Jang Ho was there. He hadn't just overheard. He had felt the shift in Ariel's spirit. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked over to Min Hee. The crowd parted for him as if he were a shark cutting through a school of minnows. Min Hee, Jang Ho said, his voice terrifyingly calm. The girl turned, her smirk faltering. Chairman, I was just... Without a word, Jang Ho reached out and took the delicate champagne flute from her hand. He pulled a black silk handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around the glass. Then, with a slow, terrifyingly steady squeeze, He crushed it. The sound of shattering glass was muffled by the silk, but the violence of the act made the entire circle gasp. Jang Ho leaned in, his face inches from Min-hee's. He whispered something into her ear. His words a dark, serrated blade. Min-hee's face drained of all color. Her knees literally wobbled as if the floor had turned to water. He dropped the silk-wrapped shards onto her empty plate with a sharp clink. Jang Ho turned his back on her as if she had ceased to exist. He walked to Ariel. The entire room was watching, breathless. He took Ariel's hand in his. His palm was warm, his grip unshakable. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at her, his eyes dark with an intensity that made Ariel's heart thunder against her ribs. He leaned down and pressed a slow, reverent kiss to the back of her hand. "Forgive the noise, my love," he said, his voice carrying through the silent ballroom like a thunderclap. "The wolves always howl when they see something they can never possess." He straightened, pulling her closer until her hip was pressed against his thigh. He looked around the room, his gaze a warning to anyone else who dared to breathe a word. "You are the only light in this room, Ariel," he said clearly. "The rest of this is just darkness." Ariel felt the erasure shatter. She wasn't a nanny. She wasn't a cook. She was a woman being worshipped by the most dangerous man in the room. She stood taller, her hand tightening on his. "Then let's give them something to look at, Jang Ho," she whispered. For the first time that night, Jang Ho smiled. A dangerous, beautiful flash of teeth. With pleasure. The penthouse was silent, the kind of silence that rings in your ears after a storm. The city lights of Seoul hummed far below, but inside the marble walls, the air was thick with things unsaid. Ariel stood in the center of the foyer, the emerald silk of her gown feeling like a heavy, beautiful lie. Her fingers trembled as she reached up to unhook the gold collar. It fell onto the console table with a sharp metallic clink that sounded like a final gavel. "I can't do this, Jang Ho," she said, her voice small, cracking the quiet. Jang Ho was at the sideboard, pouring a glass of amber liquid he didn't intend to drink. He stopped, his shoulders tensing beneath his suit jacket. "The gala was a success. The board is silenced. You performed perfectly." "That's just it. I performed." Ariel turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But I'm not an actress, and I'm certainly not a queen. This tonight, the glass crushing, the kissing my hand, it's a fantasy. It's a beautiful, dangerous movie, and I'm just a woman who got lost on the set." Jang Ho set the glass down and turned. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and fixed entirely on her. He began to walk toward her, a slow, deliberate prowl. "I'm 53 years old, Jang Ho," she cried out, her voice rising as she tried to build a wall of words between them. "I'm a size 18 black woman from a world where people like you don't even see people like me. Look at me. Truly look at me. In a month, the novelty will wear off. You'll look at the silver in my hair and the lines around my eyes, and you'll realize you made a mistake. You should have a model, someone young, someone who fits the frame of this life." Jang Ho didn't stop until he was in her space. Ariel backed up, her heels hitting the heavy oak door of the penthouse. Before she could move, he slammed his palms against the wood on either side of her head. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight, a suffocating heat that smelled of sandalwood and ozone. He leaned in until their foreheads almost touched. "Are you finished?" he rasped. "I'm being realistic," she whispered, her breath hitching. "You're in your peak. You're a lion. I'm just—" "You are Earth," he interrupted, his voice a low, jagged growl that vibrated in her very bones. "The models? They are glass. They are empty vessels that shatter the moment life gets difficult. They look at my scars, and they turn away. They look at my soul, and they see a bank account." He shifted, one hand leaving the door to catch a stray coil of her hair, his thumb grazing the silver at her temple with a reverence that felt like a prayer. "You look at M.E. and you see a man," he whispered. "You are the only person who knelt in my blood and didn't ask what I could do for you. You didn't ask for the emeralds or the silk. You asked God to keep me breathing." His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, his possessiveness flaring like a live wire. "You think your age is a flaw? Your age is your power. You have a peace I have spent 40 years and billions of dollars trying to find. You have a soul that is deep and warm. And I am a starving man, Ariel. I am spiritually empty, and you are the only thing that fills the void." He pressed closer, his chest brushing against hers. For the first time, Ariel didn't feel the need to suck in her stomach or hide her curves. His body didn't just accept her size, it seemed to crave the softness of it, the reality of it. "I'm not letting you go," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, obsessive velvet. "Not after 3 months. Not ever. If this is a fantasy, then I will burn the real world down to keep us inside it. Do you understand me? You aren't the nanny and you aren't the cook. You are the woman who holds the dragon heart in her hands. And the dragon is a very jealous man." Ariel looked up at him, her heart thundering. The insecurity was still there. A lifetime of being erased didn't vanish in a night. But as she looked into Jang Ho's eyes, burning, desperate, and fixed solely on her, she realized he wasn't looking at a plus-size woman. He was looking at his entire world. "Why me?" she whispered one last time, a final plea for logic. Jang Ho leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, barely a touch, but enough to make her knees weak. "Because you saw me," he breathed, "and now I'm going to make sure the whole world sees you." The Sunday morning air in Seoul was crisp, smelling of rain and roasted chestnuts, but inside the armored black sedan, the atmosphere was stifling. "It's a basement, Jang Ho," Ariel said, smoothing the skirt of her lavender dress. A modest, high-necked piece that felt like a shield. "It isn't a cathedral. There are no gold altars, just a few dozen people who need a little bit of hope. You don't have to come in. Your men can wait outside." Jang Ho sat beside her, his dark eyes fixed on the small neon cross sign perched above a weathered door in a quiet alley of Itaewon. He looked like a predator in a prayer closet. His bespoke black suit was a sharp, jagged line against the soft morning light. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Where you go, I go, especially to a place where I am unwelcome." "You aren't unwelcome by God, Jang Ho, just by your own conscience." He let out a short, dry huff of a laugh. "My conscience died 20 years ago, Ariel. It was buried in a shallow grave." He stepped out of the car, and the world seemed to tilt. His security detail moved with synchronized precision, flanking the entrance of the humble International Grace Church. When Jang Ho entered the room, the small congregation, a mix of African students, Filipino workers, and elderly Koreans, went still. He was a dark shadow, a tall, lethal silhouette of power and sin entering a house of light. He didn't sit. He moved to the back wall, leaning against a pillar, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes scanned the room for exits, for threats, for the noise that always followed him. The noise was Jang Ho's constant companion. It was the ringing of 1,000 deal closings, the echoes of bones breaking, the screaming of sirens, and the cold mechanical ticking of a life lived on the edge of a blade. It never stopped, not even when he slept. Then the music started. Ariel didn't look back at him. She walked toward the front, where a simple piano and a drum kit sat. She took the microphone, her hand trembling slightly. For a moment, she looked like the girl in the marketing office. Small, erased, unsure of her place. But then she closed her eyes. She began to sing. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation. Her voice was deep, a rich contralto that felt like velvet being pulled over a jagged edge. It was soulful, weighted with the 53 years of pain, joy, and survival she carried in her bones. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. The first note hit Jang Ho's chest like a physical blow. He stiffened, his hand reflexively reaching for the weapon hidden beneath his jacket, but he stopped. As the song swelled, something impossible happened. The noise in his head, the 20 years of static and violence, went silent. The ringing stopped. The ghost of his past seemed to retreat into the shadows of the basement. He watched her, truly watched her. She wasn't just a size 18 woman in a lavender dress anymore. She was a conduit. When she sang, the silver in her hair seemed to catch a light that didn't come from the fluorescent bulbs above. Her face, usually guarded by the insecurities of a woman the world had ignored, was radiant. She looked powerful. She looked eternal. Jang Ho felt a lump in his throat that he didn't recognize. He was a man of peak physical form, a man who had mastered his body and his empire. But he had no defense against this. Her voice was her superpower, and it was dismantling him piece by piece. He realized in that moment that the $5 million contract was a farce. He wasn't using her to fool his board of directors. He was a drowning man, and she was the only pocket of air in a suffocating world. He wasn't just attracted to her curves or her strength. He was addicted to her peace. The song ended, the final note lingering in the humid air of the basement. Ariel opened her eyes, her gaze immediately finding his in the back of the room. She looked vulnerable again, searching his face for judgment. Jang Ho didn't move. He couldn't. He felt as if he had been struck by lightning and survived. When they walked back to the car, the security detail fell into step, the world of the Mafia rushing back to greet them. But as the door closed, Jang Ho reached out. He didn't take her hand with the polished grace of a CEO. He gripped it with the desperation of a man who was afraid she might vanish. His thumb traced the warm skin of her knuckles. He smelled the faint scent of her floral perfume mixed with the sandalwood and ozone of his own skin. "That thing you do," he whispered, his voice cracked and raw. "When you sing, when you talk to him." Ariel looked at him, her heart skipping. "What about it?" Jang Ho leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes to savor the silence that still lingered in his mind. "Don't ever stop. I think it's the only thing keeping the world from turning black." The vast minimalist kitchen was a cathedral of brushed steel and black marble, a space designed more for architectural impact than for actual living. Tonight, however, it was being desecrated in the most beautiful way. The sterile air, usually smelling of expensive polish, was heavy with the scent of butter, garlic, smoked paprika, and slow-simmering greens. Ariel had dismissed the staff. She had even convinced Jang Ho to tell his shadows, the ever-present security, to wait in the outer hall. For the first time, the penthouse didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. She was humming a low, wordless melody, her hips swaying slightly as she moved between the high-tech induction stove and the marble island. She had traded her emerald silk for a simple, soft knit dress that hugged her size 18 frame and an apron tied snugly around her waist. She looked real. She looked like life. Jang Ho stood in the doorway, unnoticed. He had removed his tie and unbuttoned his collar, the top of his bandage just visible. He didn't speak. He just watched the way her hands moved. Strong, capable hands that knew how to nourish as well as they knew how to heal. He watched the way the steam from the pots dampened the silver curls at her temples. He felt a sharp, sudden ache in his chest, not from his wound, but from the terrifying realization that he didn't want the 3 months to end. He didn't want the $5 million to be paid. He didn't want her to be a contract. He walked forward, his footsteps silent on the marble. Ariel started as he appeared beside her. "Oh, you scared me. It's almost ready. I wasn't sure if you'd like cornbread, but I thought—" "Ariel," he interrupted. His voice was a low vibration, thick with a hunger that had nothing to do with the food on the stove. She stopped, the wooden spoon in her hand dripping. She suddenly felt the familiar prickle of insecurity. In the harsh, bright LED lights of the kitchen, she felt exposed. She felt the weight of her 53 years and the softness of her body. She reached back, reflexively trying to smooth the apron over the small of her back. The place where she felt her size was the most evident, the part of her she had spent decades trying to camouflage. Jang Ho reached out. He didn't take the spoon. He caught her hand, gently but firmly, and moved it away. Then he stepped behind her. Ariel's breath hitched as his hand, large, warm, and scarred, settled right where she had been trying to hide. His palm rested against the small of her back, his fingers splaying across the curve of her hip. He didn't pull away. He lingered there, his touch heavy and intentional. "Don't," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. I'm not a model, Jang Ho. You don't have to pretend when the cameras aren't on." Jang Ho leaned down, his chest pressing against her back, his scent of sandalwood and ozone mixing with the savory steam of the kitchen. He pressed his face into the crook of her neck, his breath ghosting over her skin. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" he rasped, pretending. "I'm 53, she reminded him, her voice trembling. "I have lines. I have weight. I have a past that's longer than yours. There are 1,000 reasons why a man like you shouldn't—" He turned her around in his arms. The movement was swift, bringing her flush against his hard, lean frame. He didn't let her look away. He cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the lines around her eyes that she hated, but he seemed to worship. "Ariel," he said, his voice a jagged, desperate velvet, "stop looking for reasons why I shouldn't want you. Start looking at the man who can't breathe when you leave the room." The silence that followed was electric. The only sound was the bubbling of the pots and the heavy, synchronized thud of two hearts. Ariel looked into his eyes and saw no lies, no contract, and no stable image. She saw a man who was spiritually starving, looking at her as if she were the only feast he had ever been offered. "You really see me," she whispered. "I see the only thing that matters," Jang Ho breathed. He leaned in, his lips finally meeting hers. It wasn't the polite performative kiss. It was a collision. It was the spark that turned a contract into a conflagration. In that high-tech kitchen, surrounded by the scent of her home and his power, the invisible queen finally realized she was the only woman in the world who existed to him. The peace of the penthouse had been replaced by a cold, vibrating tension. The glass walls, which once offered a breathtaking view of Seoul, now felt like a target. Chairman Kang, a man whose soul was as withered as his aging face, had watched the footage from the gala over and over. He didn't look at Ariel's size or her age. He looked at Jang Ho's eyes. He saw the way the most lethal man in the country had leaned into her, the way his hand hadn't left her side. "She isn't a prop," Kang had whispered in the dark of his own office. "She is the pulse. Cut her, and he bleeds out." The shift in Jang Ho was immediate. The weirdly polite fiancé was gone, replaced by a hyper-vigilant, sleeping dragon who had finally been stirred. He didn't just double the guards. He became a ghost, slipping out at odd hours and returning in the dead of night, the air around him crackling with the scent of sandalwood, ozone, and iron. One Tuesday, long after the moon had reached its peak, the elevator chimed. Ariel was waiting in the living room, a single lamp casting a warm glow over her Bible and her lavender silk robe. Jang Ho walked in, his gait slightly stiff. He didn't head for the bar or the bedroom. He stopped in the shadows, trying to hide his hands. "You're late," Ariel said softly. "The board meetings ran long," he replied, his voice a gravelly lie. Ariel rose, her movements slow and graceful. She didn't buy the lie. She walked to him, and as she reached the edge of his shadow, the light caught his hands. His knuckles were split, purple and raw, the skin torn as if he had been striking something, or someone, repeatedly. Jang Ho flinched when she reached for him. "Don't look, Ariel. Go back to bed. This world, it's not for you." "I am 53 years old, Jang Ho," she said, her voice like a steady anchor in his storm. "I have seen the world's ugliness. I've seen it in the eyes of people who thought I was nothing. Do you think a little blood scares me when I've spent my life surviving much worse?" She didn't wait for his permission. She took his hand, powerful and trembling with residual adrenaline, and led him to the kitchen. She filled a ceramic bowl with warm water and added a drop of lavender oil. She sat him down in a chair and knelt before him. It was a position of humility, but as she looked up at him, she was the one with all the power. Jang Ho watched her, his breath hitching. He was peak physical peak, a man who could kill with those very hands, yet he felt like a child in her presence. He felt the darkness of what he had done that night. The messages he had sent to Kang's men with his fists, clashing with the absolute purity of the woman at his feet. Ariel took a soft white cloth and dipped it into the water. She began to wash the violence away. She didn't ask who he had hit. She didn't ask if he was safe. She simply cleaned the wounds with a touch so tender it made his eyes sting. "They are coming for me, aren't they?" she whispered, her focus on a particularly deep cut over his ring finger. "They won't get near you," Jang Ho vowed, his voice a jagged snarl. "I will burn the city to the ground before they touch a hair on your head." "You can't fight the world with just your hands, Jang Ho," she said. She finished cleaning his skin and then, instead of reaching for a bandage, she folded her warm, bronze hands over his. She closed her eyes. "Lord," she prayed, her voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. "Protect this man, not just from his enemies, but from the darkness he carries for my sake. Give him peace that passes understanding. Soften the heart that has had to be stone for too long. Keep us in the hollow of your hand." Jang Ho stared at the top of her head, at the silver strands that he so loved, which glowed like moonlight under the kitchen lights. For the first time in 20 years, the noise of his life, the screaming for power, the hunger for revenge, went silent. He realized then that he wasn't just protecting her. She was protecting him. She was the only thing standing between him and the monster he was afraid of becoming. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, his eyes wet. "Ariel," he breathed, the scent of lavender in her skin filling his senses. "I don't know how to be the man you're praying for, but for you, I'll try to survive the night." The community garden was a patch of defiance in the heart of a concrete district. Ariel had spent the last 3 weeks turning a littered lot into a sanctuary of kale, peppers, and marigolds. Here, she wasn't the fiancée of a billionaire or a size 18 statistic. She was the woman with the green thumb, the one who knew that even the most stubborn soil could be coaxed into life if you gave it enough grace. The dirt beneath her fingernails felt honest. She was wearing an old t-shirt and leggings, her silver threaded hair tucked under a baseball cap. She felt more visible here than she ever had in Tyler's glass office. "Lord, let these seeds take root," she whispered, patting the earth over a row of seedlings. "Let something good grow in this city." The silence of the morning was shattered by the scream of tires. A sleek black van swerved to a halt at the garden's edge, kicking up a cloud of gray dust that choked the scent of fresh mint. 4 men in tactical gear erupted from the doors. They didn't look like Jang Ho's men. They didn't have the quiet, protective posture of his shadows. They moved with a jagged, hungry aggression. Ariel stood up, her knees popping, a reminder of her 53 years. She didn't scream. Her internal monologue, once a litany of insecurities, had been replaced by the iron-willed peace she had found in Jang Ho's arms. I am not a girl to be frightened, she thought, her grip tightening on her heavy steel gardening trowel. I am a woman who has survived 5 decades of a world that tried to erase me. You will not take me easily. Ma'am, come with us, the lead man said, his voice muffled by a mask. He reached for her arm. Ariel didn't recoil. She leaned into her weight. When he grabbed her, she used his own momentum, twisting her size 18 frame with the strength born of years of carrying the world on her shoulders. She drove the edge of the steel trowel into the soft meat of his thigh. He howled, falling back. I am 53 years old, she shouted, her voice ringing with the authority of the church basement. I am not a damsel. I am a daughter of the king. She swung her heavy canvas bag, loaded with hand tools and a thick Bible, catching a second man across the temple. The weight of her body was her weapon. She was an anchor, unmovable and solid. She fought with grit, using the trowel to slash and her elbows to strike, her heart hammering a rhythm of holy defiance. But there were too many of them. A third man caught her from behind in a chokehold. Ariel gasped, the smell of chemical exhaust and cheap cologne replacing the scent of her garden. She struggled, her heels digging into the dirt she had so carefully tended, but a sharp sting in her neck, a sedative, drained the strength from her limbs. As the world began to tilt and blur, she felt them lift her. She wasn't light, and she took a grim satisfaction in the way they grunted under her weight. Chairman Kang wants her alive, a voice hissed. She's the only thing that will make Jang Ho kneel. As the doors of the van slammed shut, plunging her into darkness, Ariel's last conscious thought wasn't of fear. It was a prayer, not for herself, but for the men who had taken her. God help them, she thought, as the sedative pulled her under. They think they've stolen a prize. They don't know they've just unchained the devil. She wasn't being kidnapped because she was weak. She was being kidnapped because she was the heartbeat of the most dangerous man in Asia. And as the van sped away, the garden she had planted remained. A few crushed marigolds, the only sign of the war that had just begun. The air in the warehouse was stale, tasting of rusted iron and old grease. A single, flickering fluorescent light hummed overhead, casting long, skeletal shadows across the concrete floor. Ariel Michaels woke to the bite of nylon ropes against her wrists. She didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She simply opened her eyes and waited. The sound of leather soles on concrete echoed through the cavernous space. Chairman Kong stepped into the light. He was a man who looked like he was made of dry parchment and old grudges. He stood before her, flanked by men with submachine guns, and looked down at her with a mixture of curiosity and profound distaste. So, Kang said, his voice a dry rasp, this is the woman who brought the dragon of soul to his knees. I must admit, I am disappointed. I expected a masterpiece. Instead, I find a relic. He walked a slow circle around the chair. You are 53. You are not a woman of great beauty by the standards of this city. You are, quite literally, too much of everything, and not enough of what a man like Jang Ho requires. He stopped in front of her, leaning in so close she could smell the peppermint he used to mask the scent of decay. Why you? Does he have a mother complex? Or is he simply bored? Ariel looked at him. She didn't look at the guns. She didn't look at the exit. She looked into Kang's soul with the terrifying, unblinking clarity of a woman who had spent a lifetime talking to God. He chose me because I am the only person in his life who doesn't want anything from him but his soul, she said, her voice steady and resonant, filling the warehouse like a hymn. Kang laughed, a jagged sound. His soul? Jang Ho doesn't have a soul. He has an empire. And right now, I'm offering him a choice. The empire he spent 20 years building, or an old woman who accidentally stumbled into his elevator. Which do you think he will choose when the sun rises? He will choose his throne. He will choose the blood over the lamb. Ariel felt a strange, cold pity for the man in front of her. She adjusted her weight in the chair, her size, 18 frame, filling the space with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She wasn't the erased woman from the marketing office anymore. She was the one who had washed the blood from the dragon's hands. You think you've caught a victim, she whispered. The calm in her voice was more frightening than a scream. It made the guards shift their weight uneasily. You think you found a weakness to exploit? She leaned forward as much as the ropes would allow, her eyes locking onto Kang's. You've actually just signed your death warrant, Chairman. Not because of Jang Ho's guns, not because of his money. She let out a slow, steady breath. You've signed it because you touched the only thing that kept him merciful. For months, I have been the only thing holding back the dragon. I prayed over his hands so they wouldn't kill. I spoke peace into his mind so he wouldn't burn the city to the ground. I was his tether to the light. Ariel's smile was small, sad, and devastating. But you've taken me away from him. You've broken the tether. Right now, Jang Ho is coming, and he is coming without the one thing that made him human. You didn't kidnap a fiancé, Chairman. You unleashed the dragon, and you took away the only person he was willing to be good for. For the first time, the confidence in Kang's eyes wavered. He looked at the woman tied to the chair. This old woman with silver in her hair and iron in her voice, and he felt a sudden primal chill. The video played on a loop on the 60-inch monitor in Jang Ho's office. It showed Ariel, her silver-threaded hair slightly unraveled, her lavender dress dusty, her hands bound. She wasn't crying. She was looking at the camera with a calm that should have been impossible. Jang Ho didn't roar. He didn't flip the mahogany desk. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded beneath his chin. He went cold, a temperature so absolute it seemed to freeze the oxygen in the room. The noise in his head had returned, but it wasn't static anymore. It was a single, piercing note of extermination. Sir, his second-in-command whispered, trembling, the ransom demand is— There is no ransom, Jang Ho interrupted, his voice a flat, dead velvet. There is only the end. He picked up a secure phone. He didn't call his assassins first. He called his brokers, his hackers, and his shadows in the government. Chairman Kang, Jang Ho said into the receiver, erase him. I want his bank accounts emptied by the time the sun hits the horizon. I want his shipping lanes seized. I want his properties condemned. I want him to watch his world turn to ash before I even reach his door. In exactly 60 minutes, Chairman Kang, a man who had spent 40 years building a kingdom of fear, was a pauper. His digital assets vanished. His associates turned their phones off. Jang Ho had systematically dismantled a man's entire existence while barely blinking an eye. Then he reached for his coat. The rain over the outskirts of Seoul was a deluge, a gray curtain that blurred the line between the sky and the industrial wasteland. Inside the warehouse, the fire had already started. A stray bullet had hit a generator during the initial breach. Smoke began to curl toward the rafters. The guards, abandoned by a bankrupt Chairman Kang and terrified by the legend of the dragon, were panicked. They turned toward their prisoner, expecting to find her sobbing. Instead, they found Ariel Michaels with her eyes closed. "What is she doing?" one guard hissed, his hand shaking on his rifle. "Is she cursed?" "She's praying for you," another whispered, his voice cracking. Ariel's voice rose above the crackle of the flames, low and steady. Father, forgive them, for they are caught in a web they did not weave. Soften their hearts before the darkness takes them. The main doors didn't open. They exploded. Jang Ho stepped through the wall of fire and rain. He looked like an ancient deity of vengeance, his black coat slick with water, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, predatory light. He moved through the smoke with a lethal, silent grace. The guards didn't even fire. They dropped their weapons and fled into the shadows, driven back by the sheer radiation of his killing intent. He reached the chair. The ropes were nothing to him. He sliced through them with a flick of a blade, his movements jagged with a desperation he couldn't hide. Ariel slumped forward, her strength finally wavering as the sedative and the stress took their toll. Jang Ho caught her, his large, scarred hands cupping her face. He was covered in the scent of sandalwood, ozone, and the metallic tang of rain. Ariel, he rasped, his voice breaking. Ariel, look at me. She opened her eyes, seeing the dragon the world feared. She saw the bruised knuckles, the wet hair, and the fire reflecting in his dark irises. She reached up, her warm bronze hand settling against his cold, wet cheek. I knew you'd come, she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of faith. Jang Ho didn't say a word. He tucked his head into the crook of her neck for a single, staggering second, breathing in the scent of her, the scent of the only peace he had ever known. Then he stood. As the warehouse groaned and the flames rose behind them, he walked out into the rain. He held her against his chest, her silver hair resting against his heart, the woman the world called old, held by the man the world called unstoppable. He stopped at the edge of the perimeter, where the remnants of Kang's empire lay in ruins. He looked back at the burning building, then down at the woman who had saved his soul by simply refusing to be invisible. The rain streaks down his cheeks like tears, but his eyes are fixed, burning with a fire that will never go out. He speaks to the shadows, to the rivals, and to the world that dared to overlook her. They thought she was just an old woman, he growls. They didn't know she was the only thing holding back the dragon. The Mediterranean sun was a honey gold, spilling over the cliffs of a private estate in Jeju Island. It was 2 years to the day since the smoke of the warehouse had cleared, and the air here smelled of salt spray, blooming jasmine, and, as always, the sharp, electric scent of sandalwood and ozone. Ariel Michaels, now Ariel Jang, sat in the center of a sprawling garden that put her old community plot to shame. She was 55 now. She was still a size 18. Her silver hair had grown longer, styled in thick, elegant braids that were woven with small gold rings. She wore a sun-colored caftan of heavy silk that didn't hide her curves but celebrated them, flowing around her like a regal cape. She was reading her Bible, her feet bare against the cool grass, when the noise of the world outside her gates went silent. She didn't have to look up to know he was there. Jang Ho walked across the lawn. He no longer wore the stiff, charcoal suits of a man constantly prepared for war. His linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the faint, jagged scar on his chest, the one she had washed with her own hands. He looked younger, the harsh lines around his eyes softened by 2 years of sleeping through the night. But as he approached her, that familiar predatory focus returned. He didn't look at the ocean. He didn't look at the multi-million-dollar architecture. He looked at her. The guests are starting to arrive for the anniversary dinner, he said, his voice a low, gravelly caress. Your sister is here, and your Aunt Esther. Ariel smiled, a slow, knowing thing. Is she still complaining about my bright colors? Jang Ho reached her chair and did what he did every single day. He knelt. He didn't care about the grass staining his trousers. He placed his large, scarred hands on her knees, looking up at her with a devotion that bordered on the religious. She tried, Jang Ho said, a dangerous glint in his dark eyes. I told her that if she spoke another word about your appearance, I would buy the house she lives in and turn it into a parking lot. She's being very quiet now. Ariel laughed, reaching down to run her fingers through his dark hair. Jang Ho, you have to stop threatening my relatives with eminent domain. I told you once, he whispered, leaning forward to press his forehead against her stomach, breathing in the scent of her peace. I am a jealous man. I spent 40 years in the dark. I won't have anyone trying to dim the only light I have. He shifted, his hand moving to the small of her back, the place she used to hide. He pulled her closer, his thumb tracing the line of her hip through the silk. The world still talks, you know, Ariel murmured, closing her eyes as she felt his warmth. They still wonder why the dragon chose a woman who doesn't fit the mold. Jang Ho stood up, but he didn't pull away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring. Not a diamond, but a rare, deep sea pearl, dark and iridescent, surrounded by a halo of black diamonds. The mold is for people who are afraid of the truth, he said, sliding the ring onto her finger. They look at you, and they see a woman. I look at you, and I see a sanctuary. They see old and plus size. I see the only person who was brave enough to love a monster until he remembered how to be a man. He leaned in, his lips brushing the silver at her temple. They don't get to see what I see, Ariel. That's my greatest victory. Ariel stood, her height nearly matching his, her spirit no longer erased but overflowing. She looked toward the house, where the most powerful people in the country were waiting, not to judge her, but to pay her respects, because they knew that to cross Ariel was to invite the wrath of a man who had burned an empire to save her. She took his hand, her bronze fingers entwined with his scarred ones. Shall we go in, Mr. Jang? Lead the way, my queen, he breathed. As they walked toward the house, the invisible woman was gone. In her place was a woman who was loved with an intensity that could move mountains, a woman of faith, of weight, and of silver moonlight, who had tamed a dragon without ever losing herself. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.